I'm not ashamed to own my Lord, nor to defend his cause. Maintain the honors of his word, the glory of his cross.
We are in Revelation chapter 13. We'll see how far we get in this chapter. Again, we are going to be getting into the next set of verses. You do have your next page out for Revelation 14, which you can grab at the back if you didn't do so already. We're going to reread Revelation 13, though, verses 3 to 8. I'm going to read this just for time's sake, and then we'll get into, because this is what we've already covered, and just as a quick review. Revelation 13, beginning verse 3. One of its heads seemed to have a mortal wound, but its mortal wound was healed, and the whole earth marveled as they followed the beast. And they worshipped the dragon, for he had given his authority to the beast. And they worshipped the beast, saying, "Who is like the beast, and who can fight against it?" And the beast was given a mouth, uttering haughty and blasphemous words, and it was allowed to exercise authority for 42 months. It opens its mouth to utter blasphemies against God, blaspheming his name, and his dwelling, that is, those who dwell in heaven. Also it was allowed to make war on the saints and to conquer them. And authority was given it over every tribe and people and language and nation. And all who dwell on the earth will worship him. Everyone whose name has not been written before the foundation of the world in the book of life of the Lamb that was slain. We've been talking about the beast of the sea and how what the beast looked like. We've already discussed what he looked like. We discussed that he was wounded but returned. And everyone is amazed that he returned. And we discussed that people speculate as to who this was, and we saw the representations between Daniel chapter 3 and Daniel chapter 7 and the kingdom that were predicted in Daniel's day to come, and how this beast corresponds and really compares well with the beast of Daniel. And so when we were discussing this, we were discussing that the beast is the Roman Empire. Beast is not some person today that we are still looking for. The beast, the beast of the sea, is the Roman Empire. And so he spoke against the name of Christ and his authority. He refused to accept that there was one true God. And he had an attitude, the Roman attitude towards religion and the resurrection of the dead was that it was foolish. That Paul, when he was speaking to Festus, it was called, "You're mad." And so he spoke against God. He spoke against the name of Christ. He also spoke against the tabernacle, which is the church. Rome regarded the church as lawbreakers and Christians as lawbreakers because they refused to worship the emperor. Hence, this is Peter's strong commands in 1 Peter chapter 2. Let's read. We'll start with Bill. 1 Peter chapter 2, we're going to read 11 to 20. We'll do one slide each. We'll go Bill, and then Gord and Callan around, whoever wants to read.
Beloved, I urge you as sojourners and exiles to abstain from the passions of the flesh, which wage war against your soul. Keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of visitation.
Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme or to governors as sent by him to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good.
For this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. Live as people who are free, not using your freedom as a cover-up for evil, but living as servants of God.
Honor everyone, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the empire. Servants, be subject to your masters with all respect, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the unjust.
This is a gracious thing when, mindful of God, one endures sorrow while suffering unjustly. For what credit is it if, when you sin, you are beaten for it? You endure, but But if when you do good and suffer for it, you endure, this is a gracious thing in the sight of God.
All right, Peter here is telling Christians that they are to honor the emperor. They are to do good, even when they are charged unjustly. Why? Why were people to do good, even when charged unjustly? Gord. And then
First of all, we're told to.
First of all, we're told to. This is the will of God.
That's basically the end of the conversation.
This is the will of God. We're told to. But he does give an explanation as to why this is the will of God. That by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. People should see in us the life of Christ living in us. If we are like everybody else, how are we going to teach other people that they should be a Christian? Other people, if we want them to hear the gospel, we need to act like people of the gospel should be acting. We shouldn't be rebels, rebelling against our government. We should not be people who just talk evil of our government. Now, in this country, we've been given the right to vote for our government, to speak. Given the freedom of speech. But even when we are given that freedom, we should not use it as a way to spread hate, to spread lies, and we should be respecting and honoring our government even when our government does things that are wrong, and even when our government does things that would be against us. That doesn't mean we accept what our government does and say, well, that's good. No, we don't want our government to persecute us or pass laws that make it harder for us to worship God or to spread the gospel. But the Roman Empire was not the government that was very conducive to the spread of Christ, and yet here Peter is saying, honor the emperor, respect the emperor. Bill.
Here we stop and think of what these Christians were under. Like it's nothing compared to what we live under. The Jews hated them,
Yeah.
and the Roman government despised them because they wouldn't worship
Yeah.
the Caesars, and the normal Gentile hated them.
Yeah.
It's no wonder Peter in Revelations is reminding them they're just sojourners.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know?
Yeah, it is. We also get 1 Peter chapter 4, verses 12 through 16. It's going to teach us something very similar, Jeff, before we get there.
Those other verses went on to say also that you're following Christ's example,
Yes.
who had wrong done against them,
Yeah.
did not return.
Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly right. And these are Peter's admonitions. We'll start with James, 1 Peter chapter 4, verses 12 to 16.
Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery trials when it comes upon you to test you, as though something strange were happening to you. But rejoice insofar as you share Christ's suffering, that you may also rejoice and be glad when His glory is revealed.
Dion, you want to read?
If you're insulted for the name of Christ, you are blessed, because the Spirit of glory and of God rests on you. But let none of you suffer as a murderer, or a thief, or an evildoer, or as a murderer. But that if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in
Those are words that are hard to live by. We don't like suffering. He says we don't like suffering. He says don't suffer as a murderer. Don't suffer as a thief. Don't suffer as an evildoer. If you suffer as those things, you deserve to suffer for those things. Don't take glory in the fact, oh, I'm suffering as a criminal. as a criminal, as a sinner against God. So, but if you're suffering as a Christian, you are blessed because the Spirit of glory and of God rests upon you. You are blessed, and we need to glorify God because Christ suffered, as Jeff said it earlier. Christ suffered and yet obeyed God and glorified God in all things. There is nothing shameful about being a Christian, even if the world says there's shame in being a Christian, as being a backwards person, as being an ignorant person, being a person who believes in fairy tales. There is nothing shameful in being a Christian. There is nothing shameful in suffering as a Christian. We don't really know over here in Canada what it is to suffer as a Christian. We're not persecuted like some people on this planet are for being a Christian. We can worship openly. We can put signs out saying that church meets here. We can do that. We come along and we bemoan laws that our government has passed, and our government has passed some bad laws. Some laws that make sin okay. That tell people that certain types of people, their lifestyles are okay. They're not sin. Well, yes, those are wrong. But we can still openly worship God. The government has not come in and said, you cannot teach Christ. You cannot teach the Bible. Government hasn't done that. Government doesn't generally throw Christians in jail because they are a Christian. They don't do that. They don't beat Christians. They don't kill Christians. There are some places on this planet that they do. The governments don't accept teaching the gospel. And so we need to realize that persecution may come, suffering may come, and that if it does come, we can still glorify God. It'll be tougher, yes, but we can do it. And they did it in the first century Calvin.
There's a scripture that says, those who live godly in Christ shall suffer persecution.
Yeah.
And some people think if we're suffering for whatever reason, yeah, the Bible says that, but that's not what it's talking about. It's standing up for Christ. It's doing.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
our sufferings, yeah, it's sometimes our own doings, but suffering for Christ and persecuted is a different thing.
Yeah. And we do suffer persecution, but it's just not the same types of persecution sometimes. When our government does some things to us, makes it harder to teach the gospel truthfully and powerfully, when they pass hate laws that are designed to catch people from speaking certain things, yeah, we're persecuted, but not like the first century Christians were persecuted. At least not here. Some places in the world, yes. But if we suffer persecution, we still can glorify God, and we're still blessed because our spiritual blessings haven't been taken away from us, even if our physical blessings have. So the beast, he spoke against God's church. He also spoke against those who dwell in heaven, in other words, the kingdom. Philippians chapter 3, verse 20. We're across to Shudam.
But our citizenship is in heaven, and from it we await a Savior, the Lord Jesus Christ.
Our citizenship is in heaven. That's where we want to go. He spoke against those who would dwell in heaven. The beast spoke against those, spoke against the kingdom of God. He made war on the saints, in other words, Christians, in order to overcome them. Oh, I didn't get Philippians chapter 1, verses 28 to 30. Let's go to Philippians chapter 1. I'll read it. Philippians chapter 1, verses 28 to 30. And not frightened at anything by your opponents. This is a clear sign to them of their destruction, but of your salvation, and that from God. For it has been granted to you, for the sake of Christ, you should not only believe in him, but also suffer for his sake, engaged in the same conflict that you saw I had, and now hear that I still have. The beast made war on the saints. He persecuted Christians. This is what he was doing. And he did it in Paul's day. He continued to do it, even in John's day. And it said of the beast of the sea that he had power over all kindreds, tongues, and nations. All people worshipped the beast. All cultures, all countries. They worshipped the Roman Empire, except who? Who did Revelation say except? Except those who? Written in the book of life. This is where I was telling you that the English Standard Version sort of has some premillennial doctrine woven into this this chapter. In verse 8, it says, "All who dwell on the earth will worship it. Everyone whose name is not written, who has not been written before the foundation of the world, in the book of life of the Lamb who was slain." In other versions, the foundation of the world is not in that position. It's after the Lamb who was slain from the foundation of the world. And there is a little bit of controversy. Where does that go, and what does that mean? If we're premillennial in belief, well, those who are written from the foundation of the world, they're looking for specific people. Calvinists would come along and say, God selected certain people. Well, he selected Christians. He didn't select you or me specifically that we will be Christians or we will not be Christians. But he did select Christians. He was going to save people who would follow Christ. He was going to save people before Christ who would follow him directly. But if the foundation of the world goes there, it's not necessarily premillennial, as long as we understand what the scriptures say on election and on predestination. Predestination is not talking about certain people, you, me, maybe Calla, would be saved, and I'm going to pick on Bill because I know he can take it, but Bill not. That's not how God works. God will predestine that Christians be saved. If we obey Christ, we will be saved because we will be Christians. If we won't obey Christ, we won't be saved because we're not Christians. If the foundation of the world goes after the Lamb who was slain from the foundation of the world, it goes to show that God's plan was from the foundation of the world. Just like Ephesians would tell us that God's plan was from times eternal. It was God's eternal plan before this earth was created. So it can go in either place and still not teach false doctrine as long as we know what the Bible teaches everywhere. We can't just pick one verse. If other verses talk about it, we have to harmonize those and determine what is being said. But the point is, the people who were Christians, the people whose names were written in the Lamb's Book of Life, would not worship Caesar, would not worship false gods. Christians don't do that. We'll come up to Henry. 1 Corinthians chapter 10. We'll read verses 14 and then 19 to 22. So we'll come up to Henry and then Annie for these verses.
Therefore, my beloved, flee from idolatry. What do I imply then? That food offered to idols is anything, or that an idol is anything?
No, I imply that what pagans sacrifice they offer to demons and not to God. I do not want you to be participants with demons. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake of the table of the Lord and the table of the demons. Shall we promote the Lord to jealousy? Are we stronger than him?
So, Christians won't worship false gods. They will not do that. We cannot. We were told to flee idolatry. And that means everything that goes along with idolatry. If it has to do with idol worship, we don't want any part of it. Not because, in this specific chapter, he's talking about meat sacrificed to idols. Paul makes the point, it's not because we believe anything about the meat offered to the idol. The meat is still meat. Just because it's offered to an idol doesn't make it somehow holy meat or tainted meat. Because they're just sacrificing it to demons. However, when we associate ourselves knowingly with the worship of demons, how can we worship demons, or at least associate ourselves with the worship of demons, and claim to follow Christ? And the answer is we can't. We need to worship Christ. We need to flee idolatry and all its associations. It's not good enough just to say, well, I don't worship the idol, but I'll go to the idol temple and eat of the meat. Well, we may not be worshiping the idol. We may recognize that meat is meat, but others may not recognize that. Certainly the idol temple worshipers aren't. The people who worship the idol are going to say, oh, the Christian, they're coming to eat the meat. They accept us. They think it's okay. They don't have the knowledge that meat is meat. They think the meat is holy. They've sacrificed it to their God. We recognize that meat is meat, but we've now taken down them. And that's a principle that we need to follow today. It's one we studied in our Chinese class last night, that we don't associate with idols in any way. And the Christians here in Revelation weren't going to associate with idol worship. Bill?
I just thought that the shocking fact out of those verses is how we partake of the Lord's Supper and partake of anything evil.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's true. We come along and we say, well, we're going to partake of the Lord's Supper. We're going to remember Christ, but we're also going to partake of this supper as well. This was offered in sacrifice to demons. Well, or to other gods. Well, the meat itself, we know there's nothing to it. But when we associate with idolatry, even though we know there's nothing to it, other people don't. And we cannot have both. We need to flee idolatry and all of its trappings and everything that goes along with it. Let's go on to Revelation chapter 13 and let's read verses 9 and 10. We're up to Tim.
If anyone has an ear, let him hear. If anyone is to be taken captive, to captivity he goes. If anyone is to be slain with the sword must he be slain. Here is a call for the endurance and faith of the saints.
This is verse 9 has a phrase we often hear in the Gospels. We often hear Jesus says, if anyone has an ear, let him hear. We heard this earlier in Revelation. If anyone has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. We saw that throughout the early part of this book. Well, if anyone has an ear, let him hear. Pay attention. What are we paying attention for? Well, those who are killing and oppressing the saints will themselves be brought to an end. It says, if anyone is slain with the sword must he be slain. The wicked servants of the dragon will not succeed in destroying the church and destroying God's saints. Let's get some Old Testament verses that would teach this same principle. To Jeff, Ecclesiastes 8, verse 13.
But it will not be well with the wicked, neither will he prolong his days like a shadow, because he does not fear before God.
It will not be well with the wicked, neither will he prolong his days. The wicked do come to an end. It always happens. The wicked would look like they're winning, and then they don't. Because they're against God. Isaiah chapter 33, verse 1, Gloria.
Are you destroyer who yourself has not been destroyed? You traitor whom none has betrayed. When you have ceased to destroy, you will be destroyed. And when you have finished betraying, they will betray you.
Same sort of thing. Evil is brought down. God judges and punishes evil. But what Revelation 13, verses 9 and 10 is calling for is patience and faith of the saints. This is why Christians were to maintain their faith in the face of persecution. They were to do that because the evil would be judged and the dragon won't win. The earth thinks the dragon is going to win. The dragon won't win. The dragon will be defeated. And if the dragon is defeated, the church will remain. And the Christians will go on. So if anyone has an ear, let him hear. That's the call. Continue facing persecution. Continue enduring through persecution. It's not over yet. We're about to read about another beast. It's not over yet. But God will judge and God will defeat him. Bill.
I'm just thinking we can't, like, we got to be careful lest we lose heart. If we think the wicked are going to be, God's going to take retribution on them next week, and then it doesn't happen, we'll lose heart. Like I just saw reading about Noah the other day. God suffered with man's evil until he was fed up with it, and then, of course, he destroyed the world. But yet, judgment's coming. So, if, you know what I mean? Like God, we're not sure how God deals with evil now, but we know in the end, you know, that will be the day of judgment for them. So, so we just gotta be careful if we're, it's going to happen next year, and then it doesn't, then we become disappointed.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah. We don't know when God's going to judge. Well, we do know it's coming. We do know it will come. Whether God waits till the end to judge, that's up to God. He's promising here in Revelation judgment on the beast and on the dragon. He is promising that, and we are going to read that he did judge Rome. He did judge the beast. We don't have the Roman Empire with the Caesars around. God judged Rome, but we don't know how God judges, when God judges, if God's going to judge tomorrow, next week, next year, a century from now, or when Jesus comes again. But we do know he will judge, but we do know also that God's church will stand. God is not going to allow his church to be extinguished from this earth. He will send judgment. And what that judgment is, again, we don't know. God raises up kingdoms. He brings kingdoms down. He does this in many different ways. But Christians should endure. I'm going to skip the next couple verses just because we've covered most of that already. So let's now read Revelation chapter 3, verses 11 to 18. We're going to find a second beast. We often think of the beast as one beast in Revelation. There's two. And we have the beast of the earth. Let's start with Bill. Or did you read last? I think we're to Bill. Yeah. Revelation 13, we'll read one slide each, 11 through 18.
Then I saw another beast rising out of the earth that had two horns like a lamb, and it spoke like a dragon. It exercises all the authority of the first beast in its presence, and makes the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast, whose mortal wound was healed.
It performs great signs, even making fire come down from heaven to earth in front of people, and by that signs that is allowed to work in the presence of the beast, it deceives those who dwell on earth, telling them to make an image for the beast that was wounded by the sword and yet lived.
And it was allowed to give breath to the image of the beast, so that the image of the beast might even speak and might cause those who would not worship the image of the beast to be slain. Also, it causes all, both small and great, both rich and poor, both free and slave, to be marked on the right hand or the forehead,
so that no one can buy or sell unless he has the mark, that is the name of the beast, or the number of the beast's name. This call for wisdom. Let the one who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of the man, and his number is 666.
All right, so we have this beast of the earth coming along. And we have him described. And he's a lot like the first beast. He's not the same as the first beast, but he's a lot like the first beast. And so, how did the beast of the earth deceive men? How did he do it?
Compared to the first beast, he's kind of like a wolf in sheep's clothing.
Yeah.
He's not as gross.
Yeah, that's he made himself look like the lamb. He stood in place of the lamb. It's religious error. This second beast is religious error. He used false signs. Fire came down from heaven in front of all the people. Remember, this is figurative language. We're not talking literal fire down from heaven, but that sort of evicts the picture of Elijah calling fire down from heaven with the prophets of Baal. But these are fake signs. These are fake wonders. By signs allowed the works in the presence of the beast to deceive those who dwelled on the earth. He made it look like religion, like the religion that he was standing for was true and right religion. He took the place of Christ in the place of the Lamb of God. Between the throne and the four living creatures and among the elders I saw a lamb standing as though it had been slain with 7 horns and 7 eyes, which are the 7 spirits of God sent out into all the earth. That's from Revelation chapter 5, verse 6. He supplanted, or at least tried to supplant, Christ. But as Bill said, he is a wolf in sheep's clothing. Matthew chapter 7, verse 15 says, "Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves." This beast here is a pretender. He is not, in reality, be able to do the things that he had said that he can do. Remember, Jesus warned about people who would do false signs and false wonders. Beware of false prophets. And this beast is not the Roman Empire. This beast is, of course, religious error and emperor worship. He caused the people to bow down to the first beast whose mortal wound had been healed. He spoke as the dragon. He used all the power of the first beast, which had its deadly wound healed. Whoever wouldn't worship the beast, what would happen to them? What would happen to them?
Killed.
They'd be killed. Christians were killed for not worshiping the beast. That's first beast. Christians were killed for that. And so this beast, which represents emperor worship, because it called people to worship the first beast, which was the Roman Empire or the emperor. What he does is he makes all people, great and small, receive a mark. Where was the mark? On their forehead or their hand, their right hand. This mark, we don't know what people think of it as a mark that whether it's 666, which we'll get to in a moment, that this is what was tattooed on their forehead or on their arm. Remember, this is figurative language. They received a mark. Remember, Christians received a mark. They were sealed too. And they were identified as worshipers of God. This is a figurative mark. There will be a separation between those who worship God, they're marked, and those who worship the beast, they're marked as well. Forward.
It's funny, over the last couple of decades, people have taken this verse, twisted it around. Oh, we're going to get a rice chip in our hand, and it's going to allow us this. And Gorbachev had a birthmark, and people really just twist this stuff out of context and make it apply to whatever events of the times.
Yeah. Well, and we can do that with anything, right? When we fail to recognize these are about events that will shortly come to pass, when we try to make figurative events literal events, that's where we get into trouble. When we try to identify, God sometimes will identify what the figures of speech mean. Sometimes He won't. When we get into too much speculation, that's where we run into trouble, where we say, well, this doesn't fit with my conclusion. Well, what does that tell you about your conclusion? Your conclusion is speculative and most likely wrong. And so, there would be a mark. In the first century, there were certificates handed to people who worshipped the emperor. That is recorded. Whether this is a sign that you worshipped the emperor. It was given to all who would worship Caesar. You were required to go pinch incense to Caesar and say, Caesar is Lord. That's what you were required to do. And if you did that, you would receive a certificate, and you would be able to buy or sell. That was the first bell. We can answer this question, and then we'll get to the number 666, the Lord willing, next week. If the question is, who is forbidden to buy or sell? Anyone who didn't have the mark. This was a restriction of commerce. If you didn't have a certificate saying that you obeyed and that you worshipped Caesar, you couldn't buy or sell. Your goods were seized. In Hebrews chapter 10, verses 32 to 34, we read, "But recall the former days when after you were enlightened, you endured a hard struggle with sufferings, sometimes being publicly exposed to reproach and affliction, and sometimes being partners with those so treated. For you had compassion on those in prison and joyfully accepted the plundering of your property, since you knew that you yourselves had a better possession and an abiding one." Christians could lose their possessions. Christians could suffer. But they didn't lose their reward. And they didn't really lose their treasures. They may have lost earthly treasures, but they didn't lose their spiritual treasures. So if you didn't have this mark, you couldn't buy or sell. And that was a big thing, because Christians didn't have that mark. Christians didn't worship the beast. Now, next week then, the Lord willing, we'll get into question 7, which is, what is the number of the beast? I'll have to put my chart back up. We will then get into chapter 14 as well. We're not going to spend the rest of this class talking about the number 666. But the number 666 is a very famous number. People try to figure out, who is the beast? Well, we've already discussed who that is. But we'll spend a little bit more time next week discussing that.
I'm not ashamed to own my Lord, nor to defend